When Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022, millions of people fled to neighboring countries that opened their doors. Entire families were welcomed with hospitals, shelters, and hot meals. When Syria collapsed, Turkey took in more than 3 million refugees. The same happened in Colombia and Peru, which received Venezuelans escaping hunger and misery. But when 2 million Palestinians were displaced from their homes by the war between Israel and Hamas, not a single Arab country welcomed them. While King Abdullah of Jordan said they wouldn't accept them.
No refugees in Jordan, no refugees in Egypt. That is a red line, because I think that is the plan by certain of the usual suspects to try and create de facto issues on the ground.
Egypt deployed tanks and troops on the Gaza border and reinforced the wall that separates them to make sure no one could cross. Despite sharing the same culture, language, and religion, and despite proclaiming for decades their unconditional support for Palestine, not one opened its doors. In this video, we will explain why Palestinian refugees are not welcome in Arab countries. And to understand that, we first need to go back to the year 1948. In May 1948, the State of Israel declared its independence. But it did so based on a territorial partition proposed by the United Nations that had been rejected by all Arab countries and Palestinian leaders. The regional reaction was immediate. 5 Arab countries declared war on the newly created State of Israel. On the surface, it looked like a joint offensive to defend the Palestinians and reverse a decision seen as illegitimate. But in practice, the operation had no common strategy, no real coordination, and no clear goal of creating a Palestinian state. Each country acted in its own interest. That's why Israel not only resisted the attack, but turned it around. And by the end of the war, it had secured its independence and expanded its borders. For the Palestinians, the defeat was total. They didn't get a state, they lost their land, their political structure, and much of their immediate future. In the following years, more than 700,000 people left or were expelled from their homes. This is what the Palestinian people still remember today as the Nakba, the catastrophe. But what happened next was even more revealing. None of the Arab countries that took part in the war formally proposed the creation of a Palestinian state in the areas outside Israeli control. Quite the opposite. Egypt occupied the Gaza Strip, and Jordan annexed the West Bank and East Jerusalem. Neighboring countries offered asylum to refugees, but only in temporary camps with no plans for integration. From that point on, the Palestinian cause became more of a symbol than a real political project. Photos of every displaced child and every expelled family became part of the collective imagination across the Arab world. They became part of political speech, the education system, and popular culture. And Palestine came to represent not just a lost land, but a shared cause. At the same time, the right of return for refugees was declared a non-negotiable principle. But that very declaration was used to justify the refusal to offer real integration or citizenship to the refugees in the countries that hosted them. If they were going to return to their homeland soon, then they shouldn't put down permanent roots elsewhere. But the promise of returning home became, at the same time, a way to postpone any real solution. The Palestinians never returned to their lands, and they were trapped between a lost past and a future that never arrived. At the same time, the Palestinian cause began to be used as the centerpiece of Pan-Arabism, a new ideology that gained strength in the Arab world during the 1950s and 1960s. Inspired by the idea of national unity, independence from colonialism, and social justice, it claimed that all Arab peoples formed one single nation with a shared destiny. The main figure of Pan-Arabism was Gamal Abdel Nasser, president of Egypt and an iconic symbol of Arab nationalism. For Nasser, the Palestinian cause was much more than a territorial issue. It was an ideological tool. Invoking it allowed him to mobilize the masses, legitimize his regional leadership, and channel public frustration toward a common external enemy. But in that narrative, Palestinians didn't have a voice of their own. Arab leaders spoke on behalf of Palestine, but not with the Palestinians. That began to change in the early 1960s, when the first independent Palestinian organizations emerged, like Fatah and later the Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO. these groups didn't want Palestinians to be just a symbol of Pan-Arabism. They wanted to act on their own, regain control of their fate, and speak for themselves. That independence made many Arab regimes uncomfortable, because if Palestinians became organized and spoke for themselves, they would no longer be a useful tool for national interests. The cause, which until then had been unifying, began to fall apart. And then, in 1967, came the Six-Day War. Israel defeated Egypt, Syria, and Jordan, and occupied Gaza, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, the Golan Heights, and the Sinai Peninsula. It was another historic humiliation for the Arab world. But above all, it was a devastating blow to Pan-Arabism. The idea that one Arab nation could liberate itself united fell apart. The grand rhetoric of unity and victory clashed with the harsh reality of military defeat and political division. From then on, Arab leaders began focusing more on their national interests than on pan-Arab projects. And Palestinians finally understood that if they didn't fight for themselves, no one else would. This defeat also triggered a new wave of displaced Palestinians, adding to the hundreds of thousands already expelled since 1948. More than 300,000 people sought refuge in neighboring countries, mainly Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria. But they were no longer as welcome as before. Now, Arab governments knew these guests might stay forever, and that their presence wasn't just a humanitarian issue, but a political challenge. Jordan was the first country to experience this tension. Even though it was the only one to at least partially offer citizenship to Palestinian refugees, that didn't prevent growing friction between King Hussein's regime and the PLO, an organization that had become a political and military force in the country and was trying to create a state within a state in northern Jordan. Tensions between the PLO and the government escalated into a civil war in 1970, known as Black September. The result was thousands of Jordanian and Palestinian deaths, and the expulsion of the PLO from Jordan, which relocated to Lebanon, a country that quickly confirmed what everyone in the region already knew: the Palestinians brought conflict with them. In Lebanon, Palestinians were not given citizenship and were restricted to living inside refugee camps. So, the PLO set up military bases and power structures in the south of the country and inside those camps. Eventually, they controlled entire areas. But Lebanon's fragile political and religious balance, with tensions between Christians, Sunnis, Shias, and Druze, couldn't handle the armed presence of thousands of Palestinians. They shifted the balance of power in the country, completely destabilizing it and pushing it into a civil war in 1975, only 5 years after the PLO had been expelled from Jordan. A brutally bloody conflict that lasted 15 years, involved militias from all sects, and killed 120,000 people, leaving the country completely devastated, with more than a third of its population displaced from their homes. A war they never truly recovered from. Syria, on the other hand, kept Palestinians under an ambiguous arrangement: tolerance without integration. It didn't give them citizenship or full political freedom, but it allowed them some autonomy as long as they didn't challenge the power of Damascus. In all these cases, the pattern was similar. Palestinians were welcomed as a symbol, but rejected as a permanent presence. They were placed in camps that over time became entire neighborhoods, dense, marginalized, and separate from the country's social fabric. They became distinct groups within Arab countries, not fully integrated, but not entirely expelled either. It was a way to keep the Palestinian cause alive as a regional issue without paying the political price of turning it into a domestic reality. And behind all this, tensions were building that would last for decades, and a deep fear of demographic imbalance and radicalization. Because each new camp wasn't just a humanitarian problem, but a social time bomb. The Palestinian cause was no longer a heroic struggle, but a problem that Arab leaders tried to contain. And one of the biggest breaks with the Palestinian cause happened in Kuwait, a small, oil-rich country in the Persian Gulf that had hosted one of the largest Palestinian communities for decades. In the early 1990s, more than 400,000 Palestinians lived there, 20% of the country's total population. Many of them were highly educated, working in administration, education, and engineering. They had been well received until they crossed the line. In 1990, after Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, Yasser Arafat, leader of the PLO, expressed support for the Iraqi regime, hoping a victory would strengthen the Palestinian cause. But it was a huge mistake. After Kuwait was liberated in 1991, the Kuwaiti government expelled 200,000 Palestinians in just a few months, while also denying re-entry to another 200,000 who had fled during the Iraqi occupation. Only about 20,000 Palestinians remained in Kuwait. This event marked a turning point. It wasn't just fear or pragmatism anymore. To many Arab regimes, Palestinians were unpredictable, destabilizing, and even ungrateful. And the invasion of Kuwait by Iraq and the international response led by the United States with support from several Arab countries left a bitter lesson. Arab unity was just an illusion. From then on, Arab solidarity with Palestine became much more cautious, rhetorical, and distant. To make it worse, in 1993, the PLO signed the Oslo Accords with Israel. For the first time, both sides formally recognized each other. A new phase began with promises of peace, limited autonomy, and the creation of the Palestinian Authority. But it also created a new fracture. The PLO had negotiated without backing from the Arab world, acting as a sovereign and independent actor. To many Arab regimes, that was a provocation. To others, it was an opportunity. If Palestinians negotiated alone, then the political and moral responsibility also fell solely on them. So gradually, the Arab commitment was replaced by a policy of non-intervention. Palestine went from being a shared cause to becoming someone else's problem. And also a nuisance, because it was a frozen conflict, hard to resolve, and full of strong emotions. But also one that threatened the stability of authoritarian regimes that, after decades in power, had other priorities. September 11, 2001 was a breaking point. Islamist terrorism became the world's biggest threat, and even though Palestine wasn't responsible, many Arab leaders began seeing any form of armed resistance, including Palestinian groups, as a possible internal danger. The Arab Spring in 2011 sped up that trend. Mass protests, the fall of governments, and the rise of political Islam, especially the Muslim Brotherhood, terrified both monarchies and dictatorships. And in that context, Hamas, the dominant force in Gaza since 2007, was a direct branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. To Egypt, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and other Gulf countries, Palestine became a possible source of instability. Publicly supporting the Palestinians could mean empowering radical Islamists inside their own borders. To make things worse, a new common enemy emerged for these Sunni-majority countries, the Shiite regime of Iran. With growing regional ambitions, it began spreading its influence through armed groups like Hezbollah and Shia militaries in Iraq, and also Hamas in Gaza, which since 2012 received Iranian weapons and financial support. This changed everything. Israel, which for decades had been the common enemy of these countries, now became a tactical ally against Iran's ambitions. At first, discreetly, but more openly over time, several Arab countries began cooperating with Israel in intelligence, security, and regional diplomacy. This quiet partnership was solidified in 2020 with the Abraham Accords. For the first time, Arab countries like the UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, and Sudan openly normalized relations with Israel without demanding concessions for the Palestinians. It was a historic shift. For decades, the promise had been clear. No Arab country would normalize relations with Israel until the Palestinian issue was resolved. But that promise was broken. The Palestinian cause was no longer a condition, it became an obstacle to new regional diplomacy. And that confirmed what many Palestinians had already suspected. They were alone and caught in the middle, used by Iran as a tool to pressure Israel, and at the same time, ignored by Arab regimes that no longer saw them as a symbol, but as a problem. The Palestinian cause was now secondary to the survival of their own regimes and the containment of Iran's ambitions. And that's how we arrived at October 2023. After Hamas's brutal attack on Israel, Israel's military response triggered a humanitarian crisis in Gaza. In just a few weeks, more than 80% of the population, nearly 2 million people, had been displaced. Most were women, the elderly, and children. They crowded into shelters, schools, and ruined hospitals. They slept outdoors. There was no water, no electricity, not enough food. And still, not a single Arab country opened its borders to receive them. Not Egypt, which shares a direct border with Gaza. Not Jordan, a traditional host for Palestinian refugees. Not Saudi Arabia or any other. 0 refugees accepted. Palestinians were not welcome. The official explanation was political. Accepting refugees would benefit Israel by emptying Gaza and preventing the Palestinians from ever returning. And while there's some truth to this, and many Palestinians believe it too, that explanation alone doesn't tell the full story, because they didn't even offer temporary shelter or a humanitarian corridor with a return date, or UN-supervised transit camps. Nothing. The more uncomfortable truth is that the rejection was also strategic. Egypt, for example, fears that Hamas might infiltrate the Sinai, where it already faces Islamist insurgents. And it's not paranoia. Egypt has suffered years of attacks in that region. Allowing hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, some of whom might be fighters, to cross the border would open a Pandora's box in its most unstable territory. Jordan, a population already mostly Palestinian, and a monarchy barely holding on to its internal balance, can't afford to import a new source of tension. They've learned their lesson and don't want to bring an unsolvable problem into their own land. Saudi Arabia and the UAE have a different kind of calculation, a political and image-based one. They want to be seen as responsible, modern, rational global players, and filling their countries with desperate, futureless, and potentially radicalized refugees doesn't fit that narrative. So, Arab countries publicly condemn Israel, but they also close their borders with walls and soldiers and don't lift a finger to help the Palestinians. Deep down, they know that taking in refugees means importing the conflict into their own borders. A complex conflict that's hard to solve. Now, at this point, it's important to make a key distinction. Because while Arab governments have shut their borders, their people haven't. In almost every Arab country, there have been spontaneous protests and massive expressions of support for Gaza. Popular solidarity is still alive. But in authoritarian regimes, that solidarity doesn't translate into public policy. It's repressed, channeled, or simply ignored by governments more concerned with their own survival than with the Palestinian cause. That's all for today's video. I hope you learned something new. And if you liked it, don't miss the next one.